Roger Rose, and today we're going to be talking about what is it I say when I say that is true. And this is featured in the Map is Indestructible editions to Coda 6. We're asking the question, what is the word true? We're going to be following the method that a number of O.G. Rose papers follows, which is where we try to isolate the meaning of a word from just being a simile. Often in language we'll use true and fact and actuality or in reality, all as kind of similes. And the problem with that is then there's a certain precision of language that is lost. And the underlying assumption of this method is you could kind of take Wittgenstein where he says the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Well, that would suggest that the expressions of my language are the expressions of my world. So if we can isolate a term into a distinct meaning, there would be reason to think that there is a distinct experience that needs a distinct referent. Otherwise, we're going to be muddled in our understanding of reality. So you're trying to isolate a word. We've done this with love. We've done this with beauty. And we're trying to do it a little bit with truth here. And to start, what's the difference between a truth and a fact? If I say that is true, am I saying it's a fact? Well, if so, then why in the world use the word true with all its metaphysical baggage? Why not just talk about a fact? Well, a fact, if I were to say a rock is a rock, there's a few things, right? Because you could say, well, a rock is even an interpretation. Nietzsche tells us there are no facts, only interpretations. And there's a sense in which the atoms and molecules and composition of that thing that I refer to as a rock is framed and conditioned by the human subject. So in a sense, is it really a fact? You could always argue facts and interpretations are two sides of the same coin. And there certainly is some sort of abstracting and conditioning and interpreting that makes a fact knowable, but if we were to take and incorporate Jonathan Rauch, you could argue that anyone could come along and see that similar phenomenon in a relative range of consistency of experience and refer to it as a rock. That doesn't mean saying that's a rock doesn't entail error, but there's something when we refer to a fact, we're talking about something where there's kind of a reasonable expectation of interchangeability of observer and viewer. Anyone can come along and say, that's a car, that's a rock, and be in a relative range of shared intelligibility and a shared world that can be judged by coordinated action, right? Like if I say that's a rock, we can coordinate action accurately around that statement. So the shared coordination of action across any number of subjects seems to be what we refer to when we talk about a fact. Now, what would the word true mean? Well, maybe if I were to say that's my rock, and I add the word my, because my is not located in nature the same way that the rock is. Now, we have to be careful. I'm not saying humans aren't part of nature. There's always that mistake that Benita Roy emphasizes. But there clearly is a difference in the experience of a rock from the experience of a notion like myness or ownership, right? But if I were to say that's my rock, is that a fact? Yes, but it's interesting because the fact of myness seems different than the fact of the rock that is interchangeable in experience. Like anyone could come along and see that's a rock in the way that we've described Jonathan Rauch, the distinction between belief and knowledge. Knowledge is where experience is interchangeable between observers, whereas a belief may be subject dependent. But now that doesn't mean beliefs are false while knowledge is true. That's big for Jonathan Rauch and Kindly Inquisitors. But it means the quality of the case, the quality of the epistemological claim is very different. So there's a sense in which the idea that's my rock is a fact, but there's also a way in which it's not a fact in the same way. The myness does not have the same epistemological structure or quality as rockness, right? So when I say that's my rock, I'm referring to a certain relationship to the rock. Now, there are many people online, liminal web, talking about relations being real, and there's a way in which relations are part of nature, and, Leibniz and Korbowski, it's situation all the way down. So to say the myness is a relational dimension does not mean we're now talking about something that doesn't exist. If relations don't exist, it's hard to imagine any kind of intelligibility existing. But the myness that refers to a relation is different in quality from the rockness. And this might be, then, when we say my rock, we're referring to some sort of mixture between truth and fact. And this is where truth might have a distinct meaning from fact. Now, both truth and fact, to make them distinct from false or lie, seem to require a certain justification, right? So does the phrase "that is true" mean that is proven? And then, of course, is that a fact? Mean that is proven? Well, you see, even there seems to be a certain level of justification required here, but the justification is different. Now, generally speaking, people like Karl Popper will tell us that a fact is falsifiable. A scientific is kind of falsifiable, right? Well, mindness does not seem falsifiable. Perhaps we could falsify that is a rock, but could we falsify that is my rock? Only if you knew me, right? And that means there's a certain contingency here that seems to make it a little different from the falsification that would be necessary to determine that is a rock, right? At the same time, if truth is truth, it seems like it needs to be testable. So there seems to be a certain test that is necessary. But the test of a truth seems to be experiential. It's something more lived, it's more attached to one's entire lifestyle, where falsification, I could falsify something in 5 minutes, right? But the tests of a truth may take hours or years or days. And if I say that's my rock, the test would be, well, do I take care of it, right? Do I hold it? Do I put it up on a shelf? Maybe if I were in a forest and shouted, hey, to a friend, I'd say, hey, that's my rock. Really? You're just shouting that because you saw it out of the corner of your eye and you wanted it first, right? There's no test. You haven't shown that it is your rock. Now, if you kept it in your room and you drew a little smiley face on it, like my kids, then it'd be like, okay, well, there you go. It's passed the test. That is my rock. But it's interesting how the truth seems to require a certain test, but it's more tied to a way of life, right? And so, I think often, following that Rouchian distinction between knowledge and belief, which we can overlay with the difference between fact and truth, a lot of people who say believe in a religion, say Christianity, they believe they've had lived experience. They've tested the religion, they've tested the beliefs, and had come to have reason to believe there's something true about it, even if they don't understand all of it, right? But it's tied to an entire lifestyle and emotions. Now, someone could come along and say, well, that's just brainwashing, right? You've just kind of brainwashed yourself, and that could be the case. That's always the risk with belief. There has to be that risk. But I think it would be erroneous to say many people, like people who have religious beliefs or metaphysical beliefs, or let's say they're in a relationship and they believe their wife loves them, or they have a friend that would do anything for them, or there's someone that they can trust. Are these untested? Are these just closed-minded, out-of-nowhere beliefs? No, they tend to be tested, but they're not tested in the same way as is a science or a fact, which seems to be more testable according to falsification. So facts seem to be more falsifiable, while truths seem to be more tested, but both of them have a certain justification to them, a certain feeling of being proven, a certain feeling of being not just arrived at willy-nilly. There's a certain feeling that these are legitimate. The paper is going to talk a bit about abstraction and how the fact that relationships might be abstract doesn't necessarily mean we should not conflate abstract and false any more than we should say, like, the word cat doesn't exist. Like nominalism or different things. Sure, the word cat doesn't exist like the phenomenon of cat, and we can't say the phenomenon equals the abstraction. But the abstraction exists in a feedback loop with the actuality that leads to this unfolding of the entire situation of reality. We've talked about this with Hegel and Leibniz and all these different people. So, we don't want to make that mistake. And so even if there's something abstract about the truth, that doesn't mean it's false. And that doesn't mean the term is automatically disqualified. Facts seem to be less abstract, even if there's some degree of abstraction. They're all on a gradient. But just because abstraction is involved doesn't mean we can say truth is an invalid category. Well, what about, truth? Does the phrase "this is true" mean this is meaningful? And, it's also tricky because truth can be true, but true seems different from truth. Truth has a much greater metaphysical weight to it, while the word true seems more like a fact or something. So that's a problem too, and that should be noted. But does the word true mean meaningful? That is meaningful. Well, there's something meaningful about truth, but there's also something tricky about the word meaning, because meaning can be definition, meaning can be causal action, meaning can be metaphysical assent, it can be beliefs, it can be ethics. I do think the word meaning and the word truth have a lot of overlap. I'm not sure if they're complete similes, but they seem to have a unique amount of overlap. And I'm not sure if facts are meaningful, while truths are. Facts seem to identify. Like facts identify, or they designate, or they categorize, but I'm not sure if facts mean. Now, the moment I say that's my rock, I've made a fact mean, so I've mixed the rock with a truth, so I'm dealing with a truth fact, if you will. We talk about fact views, and also we talk about worldview with a hyphen, and worldview, you have view of the world, but then you also have ideology worldview, right? So that's kind of these distinctions you get. But the moment I talk about my rock, there's some sort of mixture of truth and fact, but the meaningfulness of my rock seems to be on the truth side versus the fact side. And again, this is part of the complexity of this topic, is almost always when we refer to things, or certainly very often, we're talking about phenomenon that are mixtures of truth and fact, truth fact if you want, which is like two rivers that merge and become one, thus making the distinctions difficult to isolate, as we talk about a lot in O.G. Rose with that river metaphor. Also, it seems like truth and facts both have causal impact. If something is a fact, that can change my behavior, but a truth is also something that can change my behavior, right? But this is begging the question, ultimately, because we'll talk about meaning, we'll talk about justification, we'll talk about how everything seems to be a mixture of these things. But ultimately, the word truth, if it is distinct, and it's not merely a whim or a notion, like what's the difference between a notion and a truth, because a notion could be false, or it could be less tested, or it could be a potential truth, like all these things kind of come up. I think ultimately something that's true, because ultimately this kind of comes to a certain question of saying, okay, well, why isn't a truth a fact? And we're going to ultimately say that the word truth has to be tied to a conception of lack and excess. Like something can be true because it is actual but not complete. If it was complete, here's the issue. If a truth is complete, isn't it just a fact? Like if you can know everything there is about it, isn't it a fact, right? But there's something about a truth that is actual, that has causal impact, that is justified and proven, and yet it is not complete. But this lack is not a nothing, it's an excess. It's a certain excess. And of course, the reason why basically everything also entails truth and fact is if I say my rock, the relationship I have with the rock is in excess to the rock. It is beyond it, but it's also lacking from the rock. But it's lacking because of an excess, right? And I'm also, when I'm my rock, I'm lacking the rock in my existence, you could say. It's not part of my composition. And so it also exists in excess to me. It is beyond me, but I've also added a certain excessive principle to the rock of minus, right? And so truths are in regard to lack excesses. If not, they seem to be false, right? Like they just seem to be false. So a truth as a distinct word seems to require a reality where incompleteness applies in some sense. Now that's going to get us into what we talk about as alterological questions, like what is the quality of this lack? Is it, maybe it's a fundamental nothingness, maybe it's an excess, whatever. Here, truth seems to be tied to lack and excess. So I think that always is going to be part of the picture. And if it doesn't, then it seems to just be a fact. A complete truth would be a fact, where an incomplete truth is a truth. And that's because there is a lack access that we are meaningfully referring to due to experience, due to testing, due to justification and things like that, right? And so a final paragraph that we have for the paper, this in mind to conclude, when I say X is true, I say X is an interpretation that isn't falsifiable and only deserving of confidence, but there is still reason to believe that my interpretation of X in fact corresponds with actuality incompletely, even though due to its inability to be falsified, truths cannot be considered matters of knowledge, thanking Jonathan Rauch, but only belief. X is not merely an interpretation, though, merely an interpretation, seeing as there is reason to believe it is correct, while a mere interpretation would be an understanding where there was equal reason to believe it was right or wrong. X is a testable abstraction, even if it is not falsifiable, and for what I consider good reason, I believe it is useful and or good, though it should be acknowledged that the practical consequences of X are deeply impacted by the collective. X is meaningful, for it seems true. Truth is meaning in some sense, though X lacks sensory identity, and its influence on materiality is contingent on the will of those who assent to it. So its causal impact seems to be tied up with a human will versus, a rock can have causal impact regardless of will. To resume, still, X is something I experience, even though that experience might be mine and mine alone, and it is imaginative and is subjective, though that doesn't mean X is illusionary. Rather, X helps make a fact both meaningful and hard to access, so we talk about that. It is possible for X to be wrong, for it is contingent and not a fact in of itself, which is to say X is part of a worldview, not just a view of the world. But the way X truth can be wrong, distinct from a straight falsity, is precisely in being an incompleteness that comes to practically be experienced as complete. Upon this earth, we live meaningfully in our worlds, and our worlds could be incompletely actual and hence true, though different. Hence, the word truth doesn't have to mean the end of pluralism, and we talk about this in the distinction between earth and world in Heidegger. In a world of lack excess, truth is a word of ever participation, valid even if unfinished. That will be elaborated on in the work and the book. The Map is Indestructible. We'll be talking about these topics, these epistemological quandaries, quite a lot. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, YouTube, so on and so forth. You can find our books on Amazon. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated, and thank you so much for your time.